There is a particular kind of pain that arrives not with violence but with whisper, the kind that creeps into your chest on an ordinary Tuesday morning when someone you trust asks you to become someone you are not, and you say yes because you have never learned how to say no. Because somewhere deep in your neural pathways, in the ancient structures of your brain that remember every rejection and every abandonment, saying no feels like dying. And this is the story of how a small favor, a simple request, a moment that seemed so inconsequential, became the catalyst for understanding the deepest truths about ourselves, about love, about the invisible walls we build between who we are and who we pretend to be. When Carmen first told me what happened, she was sitting in my office with the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has passed, after all the tears have dried and what remains is a profound exhaustion, a quietness that feels almost like peace but tastes like resignation. And her voice was steady as she described that moment 3 months earlier when her best friend Daniel approached her with a request that would ultimately reshape everything she believed about loyalty, friendship, and the value of her own authentic self. And I remember how she began to speak about that afternoon with a quality of distance, as if she were narrating someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's heartbreak. Daniel had been her closest friend since college, the kind of friend who knows your coffee order, your family's patterns, the small ways you betray yourself when you are tired, the jokes that make you laugh when you want to cry, the presence that feels like home in human form. And they had built a friendship across 15 years that had weathered every storm that life could offer, every romantic disappointment, every professional crisis, every moment when the world seemed too large and too cruel. And so when he approached her on that particular afternoon in the cafe where they had spent countless hours dissecting life and love and meaning, Carmen had no reason to imagine that he would ask something that would threaten the very foundation of what they had constructed together. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he was already aware that he was crossing some invisible line, and he told her about a woman named Sophia, a woman he had met at work, a woman who made him feel something he had never felt before, a kind of nervous excitement that keeps you awake at night and makes the morning seem too far away. And he explained that Sophia was meeting his family for the first time at a family dinner, a dinner where his mother had been asking questions for months, where his aunts were already preparing their judgments, where the entire family architecture was primed to scrutinize this new relationship that was still so fragile and new. And in his vulnerability, in that moment when he was opening his heart about how much this mattered to him, he asked Carmen if she would do something that seemed so small on the surface, so reasonable, so much like the kind of thing friends do for each other. He asked her to pretend to be his fiancée, to sit across from his family, to confirm the stories he had already told them, to deflect the inevitable questions about their future, to perform a kind of theatrical authenticity that would buy him time to figure out where things were going with Sophia, time to navigate the expectations that his family placed upon him like invisible chains, time to simply be allowed to move at his own pace without the constant pressure and interrogation that his mother wielded like a weapon. And what he was asking, Carmen would later realize, was for her to become a mirror, a reflection of a life that did not exist, a lie that would protect him from discomfort. But here is what happens in the human nervous system when someone asks you to carry their burden, when someone you love requests that you make yourself smaller, that you reshape your authenticity, that you participate in a deception. And here is what neurologically occurs in that moment, in those first seconds of hesitation before the answer leaves your lips. There is an activation of something ancient and primal in your amygdala, that almond-shaped structure deep in your brain that processes fear and threat, and it sends out an alarm, a whisper that says this is not safe, this is not right, this goes against your deepest knowing. And simultaneously, your cortisol begins to rise, that stress hormone that narrows your vision and makes you feel urgently that you need to do something, to fix something, to make the discomfort go away. And at the same time, your dopamine system, that system that drives reward seeking and motivation, begins to calculate the reward of being the good friend, the loyal friend, the friend who sacrifices. And this chemical conversation in your brain happens in microseconds, faster than conscious thought, and your prefrontal cortex, that part of you that reasons and makes deliberate choices, finds itself outvoted by the older, more powerful systems of your brain that are designed to keep you safe through connection. Carmen said yes, and her yes came out soft and automatic. the way we say yes to so many things that we do not actually want, the way we perform consent while our deepest selves are screaming no. And what she did not know in that moment was that she was activating a pattern, a neural pathway that had been formed long ago in her childhood, in a home where her mother had been unpredictably demanding, where Carmen had learned that her value was directly proportional to her usefulness, to her ability to meet the needs of others, to her capacity to make herself available in whatever form was required, and her father, a man who was present physically but absent emotionally, had taught her that love was something you demonstrated through service, through the silencing of your own needs. And so when Daniel asked her to pretend, he was not just asking her to do a small favor, he was activating a wound that had been alive in her nervous system for 38 years, a wound that had never fully healed. The day of the dinner arrived with the kind of weight that Carmen could feel in her body before she even opened her eyes, and as she dressed in the clothes that Daniel had suggested, as she applied her makeup with the precision of someone preparing for a performance, as she drove to the restaurant where his family was waiting, she experienced what neuroscientists call cognitive dissonance, a state where your conscious beliefs are in direct conflict with your actions, and this conflict creates a kind of mental friction, a discomfort that your brain desperately tries to resolve by either changing your beliefs or justifying your actions. And so Carmen began to construct a narrative in her mind, a story she told herself that this was not really a lie, this was just a small performance, this was just helping a friend, this was love expressed through sacrifice, and with each repetition of this internal story, her brain released a small amount of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward. Because coherence feels good, because the resolution of cognitive dissonance provides relief. When she arrived at the restaurant, Daniel's family was already seated, and she was struck immediately by the intensity of their scrutiny, the way his mother looked at her with an expression that could only be described as protective suspicion, the way his aunt smiled with teeth but not with eyes, the way the entire table seemed to be a machinery designed to extract information, to test the authenticity of relationships, to ensure that their son was making the right choice, and Carmen felt her heart rate accelerate, felt the tightness in her chest that comes when you are about to perform before an audience that has no idea they are watching a show, and in that moment, as she sat down and felt the weight of their attention settle upon her, her amygdala flooded her system with fear, and she made a choice, perhaps unconsciously, to lean into the performance, to make it so convincing that no one would ever doubt, to give such a complete and authentic-seeming portrayal of fiancée-ness, that the line between performance and reality began to blur. And this is where the real danger begins. This is where the self-betrayal becomes profound, because when you perform authenticity, when you play a role so completely that your nervous system cannot distinguish between the act and the real, something shifts inside you. She answered questions about their future, about how they had met, about their plans for marriage and children, and with each answer, she felt something happening inside herself, a kind of splitting, a fragmentation where part of her was narrating the story while another part of her was observing from a distance, and this dissociation, this splitting of consciousness, is what happens when we betray ourselves for the sake of others, when we ignore the signals from our body that are telling us we are in danger, and by danger I do not mean physical danger but psychological danger, the danger to our sense of self, to our integrity, to that internal compass that tells us who we are and what we value. And Carmen felt her true self retreating, felt herself becoming smaller and more translucent, felt the performance becoming more solid and more real, until by the end of the dinner, she was not entirely sure where the lie ended and where she began. What Carmen was experiencing in this moment, what her nervous system was going through, is something that neuroscientists call the default mode network, a system of brain regions that activates when we are not focused on the external world but rather on ourselves, on our internal narratives, on the stories we tell about who we are. And when you are performing a role, when you are essentially lying to a group of people while trying to make them believe you, your default mode network becomes confused, because you are simultaneously trying to be present to the external reality while also maintaining an internal narrative that contradicts that reality. And this creates a kind of exhaustion that is not primarily physical but neurological, a depletion of the mental resources that allow you to maintain a coherent sense of self. After the dinner, Daniel was effusive in his gratitude, He told Carmen that she had saved him, that he could not have done it without her, that she was the best friend anyone could possibly have, and she heard the genuine relief in his voice, the release of tension that comes when a difficult situation has been navigated successfully, and she felt a surge of something that resembled satisfaction. That hit of dopamine that comes from being appreciated, from being needed, from being the person who makes things easier for someone else. But underneath that satisfaction, there was something else, something darker, a hollow feeling, an emptiness that grew with each compliment he offered, because she understood that he was thanking her for a version of herself that was not real, that he was grateful for a lie, and in accepting his gratitude, she was reinforcing the very pattern that had wounded her. She was teaching him and teaching herself that this was acceptable, that this was love. But here is what happens after you carry someone else's burden for them, after you reshape yourself to meet their needs, after you ignore your own internal signals in service of their comfort. Here is the neurological and psychological consequence that unfolds over days and weeks and months. There is a kind of resentment that begins to build, a slow accumulation of something that feels like anger but tastes like betrayal. And this resentment grows not primarily toward the person who asked you for the favor but toward yourself, because on some level, you know that you chose this, that you could have said no, that you sacrificed something precious for something that mattered less, and this knowledge creates a kind of shame, a deep shame that lodges itself in your nervous system like a splinter. The weeks after the dinner, Daniel continued to see Sophia, and Carmen found herself in the role of confidant. And she continued to support his relationship, to cheer him on, to be the loyal friend that she had always been. But something had shifted, something irreversible had changed, and she began to notice that when she spent time with Daniel, she felt a kind of exhaustion that was out of proportion to what they were actually doing. They would have coffee and she would feel depleted, they would have a conversation and she would return home feeling empty, and what was happening was that her nervous system had registered a violation. And that violation had not been healed, it had just been suppressed, and so every interaction with him carried the weight of that unprocessed betrayal. 3 months into his relationship with Sophia, Daniel called Carmen, and his voice had a quality of excitement and nervousness that she had never heard before, and he told her that things with Sophia had become serious, that they had talked about marriage, that Sophia wanted to meet his family again in a different context, and here is where Carmen's nervous system registered something critical. Here is where the amygdala sent out a signal of real threat, because she understood what was coming. She could anticipate it with the precision of someone who knows how a story ends before the words are spoken, and Daniel confirmed her fear. He asked if she would help him in one more way, if she would come to another family gathering and present their non-existent engagement as real, and this time, the ask was not hypothetical, this time it had weight and consequence. Because now Daniel was building a genuine relationship with Sophia, and he wanted that relationship to continue, and he needed Carmen's lie to remain consistent, to remain convincing, to become part of the foundation upon which his new life was being built. And this is the moment where the small favor becomes something much larger, something that threatens the integrity of multiple people and multiple relationships, and Carmen felt something break inside herself. Felt the limits of her capacity to betray herself on behalf of someone else, and she said no, and the no came out of her mouth with a force that surprised them both, and Daniel was shocked, confused, unable to understand what had changed, unable to comprehend why she would refuse him now, when she had already done this once, and what he could not see was that by asking her a second time, he had revealed something essential. He had shown her that the first betrayal had not been a one-time thing, an anomaly, a mistake, but rather the establishment of a pattern, a precedent, a new normal where his comfort mattered more than her authenticity, where his convenience was worth more than her integrity. When Carmen finally said no, when she finally honored the ancient signal that her nervous system had been sending her all along, she experienced what is called in psychology the activation of agency, the moment when a person recognizes their own power, their own choice, their own right to boundaries. And this activation is often accompanied by a flood of emotions, sometimes relief, sometimes rage, sometimes grief, because in claiming your own agency, you often have to grieve the relationships, or the versions of relationships that were built on your self-abandonment, and Carmen felt all of these emotions, and she felt something else as well. She felt the activation of her parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that is associated with safety and rest and authentic connection, and she realized in that moment that she had been living in a state of sympathetic activation, the state of fight or flight, the state of vigilance and threat, and now, having finally taken action to protect herself, having finally honored her own needs, she felt her body begin to relax into a state of safety that she had not known in months. The conversation with Daniel became difficult, became painful, and he accused her of being selfish, of abandoning him, of not truly being his friend, and in the face of his accusations, Carmen felt her old patterns trying to activate. She felt the pull to apologize, to explain, to make it right, to offer some compromise that would allow him to keep his comfort, and she had to consciously override these impulses, had to repeatedly remind herself that his discomfort was not her responsibility, that his feelings about her boundary were not a reflection of whether her boundary was valid. And this is a lesson that so many of us have to learn. This is a truth that our nervous systems have to slowly integrate, that other people's emotions about our boundaries do not change the rightness of those boundaries. But there is another character in this story, another woman whose narrative is equally important, and her name is Sophia. And while Carmen was discovering the cost of her own self-betrayal, Sophia was unknowingly living inside a relationship that was built on a foundation of deception. And when the truth finally emerged, when the real engagement that Daniel was now proposing would have required Carmen to participate in yet another layer of the lie, the entire structure that Daniel had built began to collapse, and Sophia learned that she had been meeting Daniel's family under false pretenses, that the woman she had been told was his fiancée was actually just a friend performing a role, and she felt something that Carmen understood intimately. She felt the particular betrayal that comes when you discover that someone you trusted has allowed you to exist in a carefully constructed fiction without your knowledge or consent. When Sophia learned the truth, she did not simply leave Daniel or end the relationship. Instead, she confronted him, and in that confrontation, something shifted, something that would ripple outward and affect all three of them, and Daniel, faced with the real consequences of his deception, was forced to tell Sophia the full story, including the part about Carmen, and he was forced to recognize the ways that his request of Carmen, his need for her to carry his burden, his inability to be honest with his family, had created a situation where multiple women had been betrayed, where multiple trusts had been violated, where the cost of his comfort had been far higher than he had ever wanted to acknowledge. It is here that we must pause and ask a deeper question about what drives us to make these choices. What happens in our psychological architecture that makes us willing to betray the people we claim to love? And the answer lies partially in something called attachment theory, which is a framework for understanding how our early relationships shape our capacity for authenticity and vulnerability in our adult relationships. And Daniel, like so many of us, had grown up in a family where emotional honesty was dangerous, where vulnerability was met with criticism or control. And so he had learned to manage his family's needs through a kind of performance, through a careful curation of information, through the strategic truth-telling that made them believe he was living in alignment with their expectations. And this pattern had become so automatic that he did not even recognize it as a pattern. It simply felt like the way relationships worked, and when he asked Carmen to participate in his performance, he was not consciously seeking to harm her. He was simply following the script that had been written for him long before he met her. But there is something important to understand here, and it is something that our culture often misses when we talk about forgiveness and understanding and compassion, and that is that understanding the origin of someone's harmful behavior does not require us to accept that behavior. Understanding why someone hurts us does not obligate us to continue to be hurt by them. And Carmen, as she moved through the process of understanding Daniel's wounds, had to simultaneously hold the truth that his wounds did not make her responsibility for his comfort, that his pain did not obligate her to perform lies on his behalf. And this is a paradox that so many of us struggle with, the ability to hold both compassion and boundaries at the same time, the ability to understand someone and also walk away from them, the ability to love someone without sacrificing ourselves. The aftermath of this experience, the weeks and months that followed the collapse of the performance, the confrontation with Daniel, the emergence of the truth, were not easy for Carmen, and this is where the real work of healing begins. This is where we must attend to the nervous system that has been betrayed, that has been asked to do something it was not designed to do, That has been taught that its own signals matter less than other people's comfort, and Carmen began a process of what she called reparenting herself, a process of going back into her own nervous system and slowly relearning that her feelings matter, that her intuition is trustworthy, that her body knows the difference between a yes and a no, even when her mind is trying to override that knowledge. She began working with a therapist, and in the safety of that therapeutic space, she allowed herself to feel the anger that she had been suppressing, the anger at Daniel for asking her, the anger at herself for saying yes, the anger at her parents for teaching her that her worth was dependent on her usefulness, and this anger, rather than being something to transcend or overcome, became the beginning of her healing. Because anger is information, anger tells us that a boundary has been crossed. And in feeling her anger fully, Carmen was finally honoring the original no that her nervous system had been trying to express all along. There is a moment in every healing journey when you must forgive yourself for the ways you betrayed yourself, and Carmen had to reach that moment, had to look back at that version of herself who said yes to Daniel's request and feel compassion for that woman, because that woman was trying to survive. That woman was operating out of a blueprint that had been given to her long ago. That woman was doing the best she could with the tools that she had available, and in feeling that compassion, Carmen was slowly rewiring her nervous system. She was teaching her amygdala that she was safe, that she could trust herself, that her needs mattered, and this rewiring does not happen overnight. It happens in small moments, in small choices, in each time you honor your own signal over someone else's request. Now I must tell you about Patricia, because Patricia's story is different but also deeply connected. Patricia came to me 6 months after the incident with Daniel, and she was struggling with something that seemed on the surface to be about a man named Marco who had asked her to do something that damaged her sense of self. But what was really happening was that Patricia was confronting a pattern that had shaped her entire adult life. And the pattern was this: she had a chronic, nearly compulsive tendency to make herself smaller for men, to silence her own needs, to perform versions of herself that she thought would be more attractive, more acceptable, more worthy of love, and this pattern had cost her her authentic relationships, her real friendships, her connection to her own desires and dreams. Patricia's story began not with Marco but many years earlier, in an adolescence where she had learned that her value in the world was directly correlated to her appearance, to her availability, to her willingness to make other people comfortable, and she had internalized these lessons so completely that they had become invisible to her. She did not see herself performing these roles. She believed that this was who she was. And when Marco approached her with a request that she present herself differently at a family gathering, when he asked her to hide a part of her identity that he feared his family would judge, she did not experience it as a violation, she experienced it as just what love required. And so she said yes, and she spent the evening erasing pieces of herself, and when she returned home, she felt a kind of emptiness that was familiar, that was almost comforting in its familiarity, because it was the same emptiness she had been feeling for so long that she had stopped noticing it. What Patricia was experiencing is something that clinicians call the false self, a construct introduced by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, and it refers to a part of ourselves that develops in response to environmental demands, to the need to be acceptable to the people who have power over us, to the pressure to conform to external expectations. And when we spend too much time in our false self, when we lose connection with our authentic self, we experience a kind of depression that is not primarily about sadness but about a kind of disconnection, a sense that no one knows the real us, that no one loves the real us, that if we showed our real self, we would be rejected, and this disconnection is not something that can be healed by external validation. It can only be healed by the slow and difficult process of reconnecting with our authentic self, of learning to value ourselves not based on what we do or how we look but based on the fact that we exist. Patricia's turning point came not from within her own process but from witnessing Carmen's choice to say no, to honor her own boundary, to refuse to continue participating in deception, and something about Carmen's courage activated something in Patricia, and she began to question the choices she had been making, began to ask herself what it would be like if she stopped trying to make herself acceptable and instead demanded to be accepted as she was, and this questioning was not a small thing. Because Patricia was essentially asking herself to risk everything, to risk the relationships she had built on the foundation of her self-abandonment, to risk the image of herself that she had cultivated for so many years, to step into the uncertainty of not knowing how people would respond to her authentic self. The process of Patricia coming back to herself was gradual. It happened in small moments of reclamation. It happened when she started to speak up about her own preferences instead of deferring to others. It happened when she wore the clothes she actually liked instead of what she thought would appeal to others. It happened in the small moments of authenticity that seemed trivial but were actually revolutionary in the context of a life that had been built on performance. And as she began to reclaim her authentic self, Patricia experienced something that is well documented in neuroscience. She experienced an increase in what researchers call self-referential processing, the activity in the brain that allows us to reflect on and know ourselves. And this increased self-awareness brought with it a sense of aliveness that had been missing from her nervous system for a very long time. But the process also brought pain, because as Patricia became more authentic, as she stopped performing the versions of herself that men found appealing, some relationships ended, and Marco, when he realized that Patricia was no longer going to hide pieces of herself, when he recognized that the woman he had fallen in love with was actually a carefully constructed performance, when he understood that the real Patricia was different from the one he had been intimate with, Marco struggled with this revelation. And some relationships end not because of betrayal but because they were built on illusion, and both people have to grieve the loss of something that felt real but was never actually real, because what we were building was a dynamic, not a genuine connection. There is another moment in these stories that I want to illuminate, and that moment is when we finally recognize the cost of what we have been doing, and I am thinking particularly of Isabella, who came to me not with a story of one dramatic betrayal but with a story of accumulation, of small betrayals that had stacked up like stones until they had become a wall between her and her own self. And Isabella's moment of reckoning came when she realized that she no longer knew who she was outside of the roles she played for other people, that if you stripped away her role as a devoted daughter, her role as the supportive girlfriend, her role as the always available friend, there was nothing left, and this realization sent her into a kind of crisis, a dark night of the soul in which she had to confront the possibility that she had spent so many years not living her life that she had forgotten how. Isabella's healing began with what we might call an identity project, a project in which she began deliberately to do things that were not aimed at pleasing anyone else, that had no purpose beyond her own experience, and this was harder than it sounds, because her nervous system had been trained to understand action as relational, to understand that the purpose of doing things was to create a particular response in other people, and so the idea of doing something purely for herself, purely for the sake of her own experience, felt wasteful and wrong, and she had to repeatedly override these old scripts, had to repeatedly tell herself that her own experience mattered, that her own pleasure was valid, that her own desires were not frivolous simply because they did not serve anyone else. What Isabella discovered through this process is something that neuroscience has also confirmed, that the self is not something that exists independent of our actions, that we discover who we are not through introspection alone but through the experience of choosing, of acting, of creating consequences that ripple out into the world, and that when we have spent years not choosing, when we have spent years deferring our agency to others, we have to deliberately practice choosing again. We have to rebuild the neural pathways that allow us to know what we want and to honor that knowing, and this rebuilding is simultaneously the most difficult and most rewarding thing a person can do, because on the other side of it is a kind of freedom that is not about being free from relationships or obligations, but rather about being free to participate in relationships from a place of authentic choice rather than compulsive obligation. Now I want to tell you about something that I see over and over in my work, in the stories that people bring to me, in the patterns that repeat across different lives in different contexts, and that is this: the moment in which someone asks you to participate in a lie, the moment in which someone asks you to reshape yourself for their comfort, that moment is always a moment of choice, and we like to pretend that we do not have a choice. We like to tell ourselves that we were forced, that we had no option, that the relationship was so important that we could not possibly refuse. But the truth is more complicated and more empowering than that. The truth is that we always have a choice, and the cost of the choice is real and has to be reckoned with, and we are often unwilling to reckon with it. We are often unwilling to acknowledge that refusing someone we love comes with a cost, That honoring our own integrity sometimes means risking the relationships we have built, and so instead of making this reckoning, we pretend that we do not have a choice, we perform victimhood, we tell ourselves that we were trapped, and in doing so, we avoid the pain of recognizing that we chose our own abandonment. This recognition, this understanding that we are agents in our own betrayal, is difficult, it is painful, it is not the kind of thing that leads to comfortable feelings or easy resolutions, but it is also the beginning of real power, because once we recognize that we made a choice, even if it was a choice we made under duress, even if it was a choice we made out of fear, even if it was a choice we made because our nervous system was screaming at us that we needed to stay connected to this person, once we recognize our own agency in that choice, we can then begin to make different choices. We can begin to practice saying no even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is costly, even when it is lonely, and this practice is how we rewire our nervous system. This practice is how we teach our amygdala that we are safe even when someone we love is angry at us. This practice is how we reclaim ourselves. There is a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to create new neural connections, to literally rewire itself based on experience, and this concept is both hopeful and demanding. It is hopeful because it means that we are not permanently locked into the patterns that were established in our childhoods, that we can change, that we can become different than we have been. And it is demanding because it means that this change requires effort, requires repetition, requires us to do things that feel wrong and uncomfortable over and over again until they begin to feel right and natural. And the women whose stories I have shared with you, Carmen and Patricia and Isabella, they are all in the midst of this process. They are all trying to rewire their nervous systems, to establish new patterns, to create new pathways. And it is not fast or easy, but it is happening, and it is real. But I also want to acknowledge something that is not always spoken about when we talk about boundaries and self-advocacy and healthy choices, and that is that there is a loneliness that comes with these things. There is a particular kind of grief that comes when you finally honor yourself and discover that the people you have been abandoning yourself for do not know what to do with your authenticity, do not know how to love you when you are not performing for them, and this is one of the deepest human fears, the fear that if we show up as ourselves, if we refuse to diminish ourselves, if we insist on our own needs and desires, that no one will want us, and this fear is not irrational, it is based on real possibility, because some people will not want us when we refuse to diminish ourselves, some people will leave, some relationships will end, and we have to grieve these losses while also recognizing that the loss of people who only love our false selves is not actually a loss of real relationship, it is the loss of a particular kind of suffering, it is the loss of the comfort that comes from being needed, from being useful, from being able to predict the parameters of a connection based on how well we can satisfy another's needs. What happens after this grief begins to move through us is that we become available for different kinds of relationships that are built on mutual authenticity, on mutual respect, on the recognition that both people matter, that both people's needs are valid. And while these relationships can also be difficult, while they also contain conflict and disappointment, they contain something that the performance-based relationships never contained. They contain the possibility of real intimacy, real knowing, real love, and this is the promise that lies on the other side of the pain of establishing boundaries. This is the territory that we are moving toward when we finally say no to the small favors that cost us ourselves. Carmen, Patricia, and Isabella are not unique. Their stories are variations on a theme that is playing out across the world, in homes and workplaces and friendships and romantic relationships, everywhere that humans are trying to connect to each other, everywhere that fear is being translated into the language of obligation, everywhere that someone is asking another person to become smaller so that they can feel safer. And the work of healing this pattern is the work of individual transformation and also the work of cultural transformation. It is the work of teaching our children that their feelings matter, that their bodies matter, that their no is just as important as their yes. It is the work of building families and communities and institutions that can hold authentic people, that do not require performance, that understand that love is not about meeting someone else's expectations but about seeing and being seen by another person, and this work is slow and it is difficult and it is essential. There is something I want to say about forgiveness, and I want to say it carefully and with nuance, because forgiveness is often presented as the end point of healing, as if the goal of processing betrayal is to forgive and move on. But what I have observed in my work is that forgiveness is not the goal, understanding is not the goal. The goal is integration. The goal is taking what happened to us and weaving it into the narrative of our lives in such a way that it teaches us something, that it makes us different, that it changes us in ways that allow us to be more authentic and more conscious in our future choices. And sometimes the process includes forgiveness, and sometimes it does not. Sometimes forgiveness comes, and sometimes what comes is a kind of acceptance, a kind of peace with the fact that this happened and it shaped us, and we are different because of it, and that difference is not all bad. That difference has taught us things that we needed to know. Carmen has not forgiven Daniel, and I do not think she will. What she has done is more complicated and more powerful than that. She has recognized that Daniel was operating out of his own wound. She has recognized that his request of her came from a place of fear and pain, and she has also recognized that his pain does not obligate her to participate in his solution. She has learned to hold both truths at the same time, and this is the kind of nuanced wisdom that comes from suffering and surviving and consciously integrating that suffering into a new way of being in the world, and it is far more powerful than forgiveness, because it is grounded in her own agency and her own worth rather than in her willingness to absolve someone else of responsibility for their actions. Patricia's relationship with Marco ended, not because Patricia demanded that he change, but because Patricia changed, and when she changed, when she stopped performing for him, when she began to honor her own needs and desires, Marco discovered that he did not know how to be in a relationship with an authentic woman. That he had become accustomed to relationships where his needs were prioritized and he did not have to do the difficult work of reciprocity, and so he left, and Patricia felt grief about this, but she also felt relief, because she no longer had to maintain the performance, she no longer had to split herself into pieces, and she began to meet other people, people who were attracted to her authenticity rather than to her performance, and these relationships, while still complicated as all real relationships are, were built on a foundation of truth rather than illusion. Isabella's journey continues, and she is still in the process of rebuilding her relationship to her own desire and choice, still practicing saying no, still learning that her needs matter, and she has not solved her relationships, but she has changed her relationship to those relationships. She understands now that the ways she has been showing up for her family and friends have been partially about love and partially about a fear of abandonment, and she is learning to discern the difference. Learning to give from a place of genuine care rather than from a place of compulsive obligation, and this is changing her relationships, not by ending them, but by making them more honest, more reciprocal, more real, and her family members, while not always understanding what has changed, are beginning to feel the difference, are beginning to experience her as more present precisely because she is no longer performing, because she is finally home in herself. What I want to emphasize as we draw toward the closing of these stories is that the path to healing from this kind of self-betrayal is not linear. It is not a process with clear stages or predictable outcomes. It is messy and contradictory and full of moments where you feel like you are moving backward when you are actually integrating something essential. And there will be moments, especially in the early stages, when saying no feels so wrong, so selfish, so violating of everything you have been taught about what it means to be a good person, that you will question your choices, you will wonder if you have made a terrible mistake, you will feel the pull toward the old patterns, toward the familiar comfort of self-abandonment, and these moments are not a sign that you are doing something wrong, they are a sign that your nervous system is being asked to regulate itself in a new way, that you are asking your brain to override decades of learned patterns, and your brain is naturally resistant to this, naturally preferring the familiar paths that have been worn deep by years of repetition. The key to moving through these moments is to develop what is called distress tolerance, the ability to be present to uncomfortable emotions without acting on them, without using them as a reason to return to old patterns, and this is a skill that can be developed, that can be practiced, and one of the most powerful ways to practice it is through the body, through learning to notice what discomfort actually feels like, learning to breathe through it, learning to remind your nervous system that discomfort is not the same as danger, that you can feel uncomfortable and still be safe, and this practice, done over and over, slowly teaches your nervous system that you can survive the discomfort of saying no, that you can tolerate other people's disappointment, that you can live with the consequences of honoring your own boundaries. And once your nervous system learns this, once it truly integrates this learning, something shifts, and you begin to move through the world with a different kind of confidence, a different kind of presence, and you begin to attract different kinds of relationships, different kinds of people, because you are no longer broadcasting the message that you are available to be used, that you are willing to abandon yourself for someone else's comfort. There is a woman named Rosa who I want to tell you about, because Rosa's story is about what happens when you begin to heal, when you begin to establish boundaries, when you begin to honor your own needs, and you watch the ripple effects move through your entire life and world. Rosa had lived her entire adult life in a state of what she called service. She had been a teacher, a caregiver, a daughter to aging parents, a friend to people who needed her, and she had organized her identity entirely around her usefulness. And at 63 years old, after her parents had passed and her children were grown and her career was winding down, Rosa found herself facing an existential question. If she was not useful, who was she? And this question terrified her, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was afraid that the answer might be nobody, that she might discover that there was no essential Rosa underneath all the roles she had played. And so she began a process of what she called her real life, a process of discovering who she was when she was not doing something for someone else. And what she discovered was startling. Rosa discovered that she had opinions about things, that she had aesthetic preferences, that she had dreams that had nothing to do with meeting anyone else's needs, and she began to live those dreams. She took a pottery class because she wanted to, she joined a hiking club because it sounded fun, she traveled alone because she wanted to see the world from her own perspective, and as she did these things, as she claimed her own life, her relationships began to shift. Some people found her less available and were disappointed. Some people who had depended on her rose to the occasion and figured things out without her, and some people, when they discovered that Rosa was no longer going to organize her life around their needs, simply left. And Rosa found that she did not care as much as she thought she would, because what she had discovered was that she liked herself, that being herself was enough, that she did not need to be necessary to be worthy of love or connection. And this realization, late as it came in her life, was transformative. And Rosa began to meet other people, people who wanted to spend time with her not because she was useful to them but because they enjoyed her company, because they liked the person she was. And these relationships, though smaller in number than the relationships that had been based on her usefulness, were deeper and more nourishing. And Rosa felt for the first time in her life that she was actually living, that she was actually present in her own life, rather than performing in someone else's. The lesson that Rosa's story holds for us is that it is never too late, that healing and transformation are not limited to people in their 20s and 30s, that the human nervous system has the capacity to rewire itself at any age, that the constraints that we think are permanent are often just patterns that have been in place so long that we have forgotten they are negotiable. And this is especially important for those of us who have spent decades abandoning ourselves, who have forgotten what our own desires even feel like, because it means that we can reclaim ourselves, that we can have authentic relationships, that we can live as the authors of our own lives rather than as supporting characters in someone else's story. And this reclamation is possible not because it is easy, but because the alternative, the continuation of self-abandonment, becomes increasingly painful, increasingly exhausting, until eventually the pain of staying the same exceeds the pain of changing. And that is when transformation becomes possible. When we reach the tipping point and we finally decide that we would rather face the discomfort of authenticity than continue to live the comfort of performance. I want to speak now about what happens in the nervous system when we finally align our external actions with our internal truth, when we finally say yes only when we mean yes and no when we mean no, when we finally stop performing and start being. And what happens is something that researchers call coherence, and coherence is different from happiness. It is different from comfort. Coherence is a state in which your nervous system, your body, your words, and your actions are all aligned, are all pointing in the same direction, and this alignment creates a kind of resonance in your being, a kind of quiet knowing that you are living in truth. And this coherence is not constantly pleasurable. There are still difficult moments, there is still conflict and disappointment, but these difficulties are happening in the context of truth rather than in the context of performance, and that makes all the difference. Because when difficulties arise in the context of truth, you can work with them. You can address them, you can choose how to respond, but when difficulties arise in the context of performance, all you can do is keep performing, keep lying, keep abandoning yourself, and the difficulty compounds, the pain deepens, the fragmentation becomes more profound. There is a particular kind of relief that comes when you finally stop lying, when you finally stop trying to be someone you are not, and this relief is so profound that it can sometimes feel like sadness, because relief and sadness are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same feeling, the feeling of finally allowing yourself to be who you are. The feeling of finally putting down a burden that you have been carrying for so long that you forgot you were carrying it, and when you finally put it down, you feel the absence of it, you feel the space where the burden was, and that space feels vast and empty and terrifying and liberating all at the same time, and this is the moment where many people return to the old patterns, because the space feels too big, because the absence feels too loud, because the freedom feels too frightening. And the old patterns whisper that it would be easier to pick up the burden again, that at least with the burden you knew who you were, at least with the burden you had a purpose, and resisting this whisper, continuing to walk forward into the space of authenticity even when it feels terrifying. This is the work of healing, this is how we transform, this is how we become ourselves. Now I want to address something that often comes up when people are in the process of establishing boundaries and reclaiming themselves. And that is the question of whether they are being selfish, and I want to be very clear about this. Taking care of yourself is not selfish, honoring your own needs is not selfish, requiring that you be treated with respect is not selfish, saying no when you do not want to say yes is not selfish. And I say this not to make it easier for you, I say this because it is true. Selfishness is a distortion of self-care. Selfishness is taking care of your own needs at the expense of actively harming others. But healthy boundaries and healthy self-care are about taking care of your own needs without requiring that anyone else be harmed in the process. There is a difference, and it is an important difference. And the reason I emphasize this is because so many of us have been taught that our needs are inherently selfish, that wanting things for ourselves is inherently wrong, that the more we abandon ourselves for others, the better people we are. And this teaching, this false equation between goodness and self-abandonment, is one of the most damaging teachings that circulates in our culture, and it is particularly damaging to women, who have been socialized for generations to be the caretakers, the peacekeepers, the people who make everyone else comfortable. And in the service of this teaching, women have abandoned themselves in countless ways. And the cost of this abandonment is enormous. It is visible in depression and anxiety and disease, in broken dreams and unexpressed talents, in relationships that are hollow because they are built on performance rather than authenticity, in selves that are fragmented and lost because they have spent so many years looking everywhere else for their worth that they have forgotten where to look for it inside themselves. And so when I say that saying no is not selfish, I am also saying that you have a right to be selfish, that there is nothing wrong with you taking care of your own needs, that your needs matter just as much as anyone else's needs, and this message, simple as it is revolutionary for many people, because it contradicts everything they have been taught, and accepting this message requires a kind of courage, requires you to be willing to be seen as selfish by people who are accustomed to your self-abandonment, requires you to tolerate the discomfort of disappointing people, requires you to accept that not everyone will understand or approve of your choices, and this is part of the cost of authenticity, this is part of what it means to reclaim yourself, and it is a cost worth paying. Let me tell you about one more woman, and her name is Marta, and Marta came to me after her daughter had made a choice similar to Carmen's. Marta's daughter had refused to participate in a lie that her fiancé was asking her to participate in, and Marta's immediate response was anger and disappointment, because Marta had lived her entire life according to the code that Carmen had grown up in. Marta believed that a good woman does what she is asked, that she makes sacrifices, that she puts her family first, and so when her daughter refused to do this, when her daughter honored a boundary even at the cost of her relationship, Marta saw it as a kind of betrayal of everything she had taught her daughter, everything she had struggled to model, and she was devastated, and angry, and she blamed her daughter for the breakup, and it took time, a lot of time, before Marta began to question the code that she had been living by, began to wonder if the way she had lived her life, the constant self-abandonment, the chronic availability, the willingness to shape herself according to others' needs, if maybe that had not been the right way, and this wondering led to a kind of reckoning, a kind of grief, because Marta realized that she had spent 60 years teaching her daughter one thing, and then she watched her daughter have the courage to do something different, and that was both beautiful and painful, because it meant that Marta's daughter had learned a lesson that Marta herself had not learned until it was almost too late. But here is what happened next, and this is where the story becomes about healing across generations. Marta began to talk to her daughter, really talk to her, began to ask her questions about how she had learned to know her own needs, began to listen to her daughter's explanations about what it meant to live with integrity, and slowly, Marta began to understand, began to recognize that her daughter's choice had not been a rejection of her but rather a completion of her, that by refusing to abandon herself, by refusing to participate in deception, by requiring authenticity in her relationships, her daughter was honoring something that Marta had secretly always wanted to honor, and as Marta began to make peace with her daughter's choice, something shifted in Marta too, and she began to question her own patterns, began to wonder what it would be like if she started to honor her own needs, if she started to say no when she wanted to say no, if she started to live as if her own life mattered. And while Marta's process of change was slower, while her nervous system took longer to rewire itself after 60 years of conditioning, it began to happen, and the relationship between Marta and her daughter deepened, not because they stopped having conflicts or disagreements, but because they began to have those conflicts and disagreements in the context of authenticity rather than performance. And they began to actually know each other, the real versions of each other, rather than the performed versions. And this knowing was worth more than any false peace that had come from self-abandonment. This brings me to something that I think is essential to understand about healing, and that is that healing is not primarily about fixing relationships. Healing is about reclaiming your life, about becoming present to your own experience, about learning to value yourself not based on what you do for others but based on the simple fact that you exist and your existence matters. And sometimes as a consequence of this healing, relationships do change, do deepen, do become more authentic, but sometimes as a consequence of this healing, relationships end, and both outcomes are part of the healing, both outcomes are valid, both outcomes are what needs to happen, and we cannot control which outcome will occur, we can only control whether we are willing to do the work of becoming authentic, of saying no, of honoring our boundaries, and then allowing the relationships to reorganize themselves around this new truth of who we are. And this is an act of faith, it is an act of trusting that relationships that are built on our authenticity are relationships worth having, that people who can accept and love the real us are people worth keeping in our lives, and that if people leave because we stop performing for them, then those were not real relationships anyway, they were performances that happened to have human beings in them, and that is not the same thing as love. I want to bring you back to Carmen now, because it is important to understand what happened after she said no to Daniel, after the friendship fractured, after the truth emerged about the lies that had been built on the foundation of her performance, because this is where the real transformation happened, this is where Carmen learned something that could not have been learned any other way. Carmen learned that she could survive the loss of a 15-year friendship, she learned that she could say no and not die. She learned that other people's anger at her boundaries did not mean her boundaries were wrong. She learned that her own sense of integrity was worth more than her desire to be liked. And these are not small learnings. These are the kinds of things that reorganize the nervous system, that change how you move through the world. And as Carmen integrated these learnings, as she practiced saying no in smaller situations, as she built up a library of experiences in which she honored herself and the world did not end, her nervous system began to relax, began to trust that she was safe, and this allowed her to be more present, more authentic, more alive in all of her relationships, and eventually, she found herself in a romantic relationship with a man named Thomas, and Thomas was someone who wanted her, not because she was performing for him, but because she was herself. And when Thomas asked her to do something that required her to compromise her integrity, Carmen knew how to say no, and Thomas respected that no. and they worked through whatever issue had prompted the request, and Carmen realized that this was what healthy relationships felt like. This was what it meant to be in a relationship with someone who could tolerate your autonomy, who could accept your boundaries, who could love the real you. And I want to tell you about Isabella again, because Isabella's story continues, and it continues in a way that is instructive. Isabella began to establish boundaries with her family, began to say no to some of the endless requests for her time and energy, and her mother, who had for so many years depended on Isabella's availability, began to experience something that looked like withdrawal, began to feel the absence of the constant support that she had become accustomed to, and Isabella's mother blamed Isabella for this, blamed her for being selfish, for abandoning the family, for not being the daughter that she had always been, and Isabella felt the pull of the old patterns, felt the guilt rising up in her nervous system, felt the internal voice telling her that she should give in, that she should return to the old ways, that her mother's pain was her responsibility to fix. But Isabella had learned something crucial in her therapy and in her practice of honoring her boundaries. And that was that her mother's pain was not her responsibility, that her mother's feelings about her boundaries were not a reflection of whether her boundaries were valid, and so she maintained her boundaries, and something extraordinary happened. Isabella's mother, deprived of the ability to delegate her emotional needs to Isabella, began to have to face her own internal world, began to have to figure out her own life, began to reach out to friends and community in ways she had not in years, began to develop a life that was not entirely dependent on her daughter's availability. And while this process was painful, while there were moments when Isabella's mother was angry and resentful, eventually something else began to happen. Eventually Isabella's mother began to respect her daughter more, began to see that her daughter was capable and strong and worthy of respect, and the relationship between them, though different, though less enmeshed, though requiring more conscious effort, began to become more real, more reciprocal, more genuinely loving. This is the paradox of healthy boundaries. This is the mystery that we often cannot see until we have lived through it, and that is that the people we are trying to protect through our self-abandonment, the people we are trying to keep comfortable through our performance, these people are often being harmed by our self-abandonment. They are being prevented from developing their own capacity to deal with their own emotions, to solve their own problems, to become more autonomous and more capable human beings. And when we finally establish boundaries, when we finally stop performing, we are not just healing ourselves, we are also, paradoxically, giving these people the gift of having to become more themselves. And many people will resist this gift at first, will be angry about it, will try to manipulate us back into our old patterns. But some people, if we are consistent, if we maintain our boundaries with love and compassion while still maintaining them, some people will eventually recognize that something important has shifted, that the relationship is now more honest, more real, more mutually respectful, and they will begin to value this new version of the relationship, even if it requires more from them, even if it requires them to tolerate our autonomy, to accept our boundaries, to recognize that they are not the center of our universe. And this realization, this maturation, this growth, is sometimes the greatest gift we can give to another person, the gift of requiring them to become more fully themselves. I have been thinking about what to say at the end of these stories, how to tie together all of these threads, all of these women, all of these transformations, and what I keep coming back to is this: the choice to be authentic, the choice to say no, the choice to honor your own integrity even when it costs you something that feels precious. This choice is simultaneously the most difficult choice and the most straightforward choice. It is difficult because it goes against everything we have been taught, against the patterns that have been wired into our nervous systems, against the deep fear that we are unworthy of love if we are not useful, if we are not performing, if we are not making ourselves smaller for others. And it is straightforward because at its core it is simply a question of whether you value yourself, whether you believe that your own integrity matters, whether you think that your authentic life is worth more than a performance life, whether you are willing to risk the loss of false connections in order to make space for real ones. And the answer to this question, the decision to say yes to yourself, to say yes to your own life, to say yes to the messy, complicated, difficult work of being authentic, this decision is available to you right now, in this moment, in every moment, regardless of what you have done before, regardless of how long you have been abandoning yourself. Regardless of how many times you have said yes when you meant to say no, this decision is always available to you, and the work of making this decision again and again, of practicing it, of building a nervous system that can tolerate the discomfort of authenticity, this work is sacred work. This is the work of reclaiming your life, and it is never too late to begin. What I hope these stories have illuminated for you is that when someone asks you to participate in their deception, when someone asks you to reshape yourself for their comfort, when someone asks you to make yourself smaller so that they can feel safer, what they are asking is not actually a small thing. What they are asking is a violation of your integrity, even if they do not mean it that way. Even if they are not conscious of what they are asking, the impact on you is real, the cost is real. And you have the right to refuse, you have the right to say no, you have the right to insist on your own authenticity. And in insisting on this, in honoring this right, you are not being selfish, you are not being cruel, you are not being a bad friend or a bad partner or a bad family member, you are being someone who values themselves, someone who understands that genuine connection can only happen between authentic people, someone who is willing to risk the comfort of performance in order to find the realness of genuine relationship, and this person, this authentic person, this person who says no and means it and holds the boundary even when it is hard, this person is someone worth being, this person deserves love, this person deserves a life that is genuinely theirs. And if you are someone who is struggling with this, who is trying to find your way back to authenticity after years of performance, if you are someone who is learning to say no for the first time, if you are someone who is grieving the loss of relationships that were built on performance, if you are someone who is discovering that there is actually a self underneath all the roles you have played, then I want to tell you this: your struggle is not a sign that you are doing something wrong, your struggle is a sign that you are doing something right, that you are asking your nervous system to reorganize itself in a way that is healthier and more true. And this reorganization is not easy, but it is possible. And you are already beginning it by reading these words, by considering these ideas, by questioning the patterns that have shaped you, and the continuation of this journey is available to you in every single moment, in every choice you make to honor yourself or to abandon yourself, in every yes and every no. And I trust that you will make the choices that lead you toward authenticity, that lead you toward real connection, that lead you toward a life that is genuinely yours, and I believe that this is possible for you, because it is possible for all of us, because the human nervous system, for all of its capacity to learn patterns of self-abandonment, has an equal capacity to learn patterns of authenticity, and this capacity is not something you have to earn or deserve, it is your birthright, it is your nature. It is what you are made of underneath all the performance and all the roles and all the ways you have learned to make yourself acceptable, and the reclamation of this nature. This authenticity, this genuine self, this is the healing that is available to you now.